New Orleans was hit by a hurricane of apocalyptic proportions. America's worst nightmare has come to pass. On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to talk about, shall we say, precognition. There are certain stories that have come out in recent years about such a disaster. For example, in the Scientific American magazine, October 2001, there is a story entitled The Drowning of New Orleans. Gerstrom is here to discuss with me precognition. How about it, Gary?
How about that, indeed. Precognition, a fancy term meaning having the intuition to know something in advance. Now, in the Bible, it's called prophecy, but J.R. and I have spent a while talking about this, and we've agreed that prophecy, quote unquote, doesn't always come to godly men. It sometimes comes to the ungodly as well. And J.R. uses the example of Nebuchadnezzar, an evil man, and yet the Lord sent him a precognitive vision, which had to be interpreted by Daniel. Well, here is the National Geographic October 2004 edition. And J.R., there is an article in here that you and I have just been amazed at. The title of the article is Gone with the Water. And it's all about what would happen if a Category 5 hurricane did certain things out in the Gulf of Mexico and then drew a bead on New Orleans. And J.R., the opening paragraphs, and we don't have time to read them verbatim, but let me just read the opening words. It was a broiling August afternoon in New Orleans.
Hold it right there, Gary. This happened in August.
Yes.
This is incredible. He's reading something that was published 11 months ago.
11 months actually prior to Hurricane Katrina. And by the way, August is not the peak hurricane season usually. It was a broiling August afternoon in New Orleans, Louisiana, the Big Easy, the city that care forgot. Those who ventured outside moved as if they were swimming in Tupelo honey. Those inside paid silent homage to the man who invented air conditioning as they watched TV storm teams warn of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Nothing surprising there. Hurricanes in August are as much part of life in this town as hangovers on Ash Wednesday. But the next day, the storm gathered steam and drew a bead on the city. And J.R., as the author, Joel Bourne, writes in National Geographic, as he writes about the details of this thing hitting New Orleans, he talks about the bursting of the levees. He talks about a liquid brown water wall washing over the brick ranch homes of Gentilly, over the clapboard houses of the 9th Ward, over the white column porches of the Garden District, until it raced through the bars and strip joints on Bourbon Street like the pale rider of the apocalypse. He actually uses that term. Isn't that amazing?
And in one paragraph he says, and I quote, "The killer for Louisiana is a Category 3 storm. At 72 hours before landfall, it becomes a Category 4. At 48 hours, and a Category 5. At 24 hours, coming from the worst direction."
Yes.
That's incredible, isn't it?
And 11 months before it actually happened, it appeared in National Geographic. And J.R.,
he talks about the levees breaking. He talks about the floodwaters.
Yes.
Now it takes 2 months to drain the city.
Exactly. And how the people are gathered on their rooftops because they didn't have anywhere else to go.
Yeah. You got to read about that.
Oh, listen.
Read about that.
Well, we have here thousands drowned in the murky brew that was soon contaminated by sewage and industrial waste. Thousands more who survived the flood later perished from dehydration and disease. As they waited to be rescued, it took 2 months to pump the city dry. And by then, the Big Easy was buried under a blanket of putrid sediment. And of course, that part of the prophecy, quote unquote, has not been fulfilled yet.
Yes.
The city hasn't been dried out.
But about the people being on the rooftops, this is amazing. Now, how did this man, and by the way, you got to understand that a Scientific American magazine article in 2001, October 2001, called The Drowning of New Orleans, gave a similar story. How did these people know in advance? Is it possible that in our day, God is speaking to people or giving them inspiration. Maybe, they wake up with it. I think I'll write a story about this. This will be a great story. Is it possible that God, I'm not talking about psychics now, I'm not talking about Edgar Cayce or Nostradamus, I'm talking about just getting an idea. Could ideas come from God that could pre-tell such things as this?
Well, J.R., we've discussed, we've discussed this at great length, and we've discussed the sinking of the Titanic.
Yes.
At the turn of the 20th century. Now, everybody's heard of the Titanic. One of the most famous movies of our era features the sinking of the Titanic. And yet there's perhaps a little-known story that's maybe more exciting than the surface stories we hear about.
In 1898, 14 years before the Titanic went down, Morgan Robertson wrote a novel called Futility, the Wreck of the Titan. Instead of Titanic, he called it the Titan. This is 14 years before the event, in which he says a big, fast, luxurious ship, 800 feet long, starts her maiden voyage in April, the same month that the Titanic went down. And even to the inadequate lifeboats, this genius of the sea saw with the eyes of a seer. And it goes on to say the number of persons on board the Titan were 3,000, or that is the capacity was 3,000. The Titanic, 2,200. The number of lifeboats aboard the Titan were 24. The Titanic had 20. The speed at impact with the iceberg, the Titan 25 knots, the Titanic 23 knots. The displacement tonnage of the liner, Titan 75,000, Titanic 66,000. The length of the ship, Titan was 800 feet, the Titanic 882.5 feet. The number of propellers, the Titan had 3, the Titanic had 3. They both occurred in April. Gary, how can such a thing be written 14 years before the event and even get the name so close?
And Morgan Robertson wrote about this ship striking an iceberg on the forward starboard side.
Yes.
In other words,
exactly at the right place.
Exactly at the right place. The fictional Titan, 14 years before the actuality. He wrote about this. In fact, J.R., one of the features of his novel when he wrote about the Titan was that there were not enough lifeboats aboard to save the people as the ship went down.
Yes.
Now, this was, of course, one of the major features of the Titanic sinking. Who's going to go on the lifeboat?
Yes.
How did he know that?
Now, we're not saying this man was a psychic. We're saying there is the possibility that God, in the last days, would cause young men to see visions and old men to dream dreams.
Yes.
What can I say?
Right.
Furthermore, Morgan Robertson went on to write a couple of more books. He wrote a book later called Beyond the Spectrum. In this book, he described a futuristic war fought with aircraft that carried what he called sun bombs. These bombs were so powerful that one brilliant flash of blinding light, one single bomb, could destroy an entire city. When this book was written, airplanes were still tiny, dangerous machines that could barely carry one man, much less such a bomb. Furthermore, Robertson's future war begins in the month of December when the Japanese stage a sneak attack on Hawaii.
How did he know?
How did he know so many years before? That's incredible.
Well, J.R., it's my feeling, and I think it's shared by a lot of people these days, that the Lord is warning us. Straighten up. The prophets of old would come before the kings of Israel and Judah, and they would say, King, straighten up. Thus saith the Lord. And if you don't, this is what's going to happen to you. Perhaps we're going through a similar period now in a slightly different way.
Yes. Now, I would not classify these men in the realm of an Edgar Cayce or a Nostradamus. I would say that they just simply got an idea and wrote a novel. But what is so remarkable is those things seem to have come to pass. And we've just got started on today's program. We're going to tell you about the Twin Towers in just a moment. And a man by the name of Joel Rosenberg, who wrote The Last Jihad, that tells the story about Arab terrorists getting an airplane and flying it on a suicide mission. This is incredible.
Yes.
We'll be back in just a moment. In the book entitled The Last Jihad by Joel Rosenberg, he wrote this 11 months before the 9/11 occurrence and when the Twin Towers were felled. And he writes in chapter 1, opens the book with the terrorists, Arab terrorists, flying this airplane in for a suicide mission. And in his latest book entitled The Ezekiel Option, this is what he writes. The first page of his first thriller, The Last Jihad, put readers inside the cockpit of a hijacked jet coming in on a kamikaze attack into an American city. But it was written, he says here, 9 months before September 11, 2001. As jihad unfolds, an American president finds himself in a war with Saddam Hussein over terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Isn't that amazing? He says it was published 5 months before the actual war with Iraq began. And he goes on to say, in his second novel entitled The Last Days, has the death of Yasser Arafat. And then in this book, The Ezekiel Option, an explosive new thriller, he says Saddam Hussein is overthrown, Arafat is out of the way, a dazzling era of security, except we have a problem with Iran building up nuclear weapons. Now, how can these things be written before they come to pass? Gary, it's my feeling that God has a way of telling the world what he's going to do. In the Bible, we call it prophecy. Now, before you condemn these men for being like Nostradamus, I'm not saying that they are in that category. I'm simply saying they got an idea. But where did the idea come from? That's the point.
Well, J.R., I'm of the opinion that ideas, and by the way, this is an idea that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, that grand ideas are not the product of human thinking, but rather they come from above. And are infused into the human psyche, and they're set down on paper or they're demonstrated in other ways. Yes. I think that ideas come from the spiritual realm.
Well, we know that the Bible was actually verbally inspired of God. So this Bible, every book of it was written with a divine design. And so if God could do that to the Bible, he can do it with songs, he can do it with novels, and it appears that he is doing it in these days.
And by the way, the book, The Ezekiel Option, that you just were looking at, is basically structured around Ezekiel 38 and 39, which features a number of what we would call very familiar looking patterns in the modern world. People dwelling carelessly, that is, people thinking, oh, God's not watching, we can pretty much do what we want to do. And in fact, that was the way it was in the Big Easy. New Orleans is called the Big Easy. Nothing bad's going to happen to us. We're okay. We'll be okay. God's not watching, etc., etc.
Well, in our October magazine, I have an article called America's Tsunami, in which I quoted from Ezekiel 38 and 39. It shall be in the latter days, Ezekiel said, my fury shall come up in my face, says God, in the jealousy and fire of my wrath. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land. I'll plead with him against him with an overflowing rain upon those who dwell carelessly in the coastlines. Gary, how can this be written except it be of God?
Absolutely. And J.R., I think that there is a feeling, and I hate to use the term feeling, perhaps an intuition out there among Christians, and we're talking to a Christian audience here, among others. I think there's this intuitive idea that something is unstable, there's a little bit of a feeling right now that something could happen. The old stability, the idea that everything was always going to remain the same, I believe has been undermined by recent events.
I wanted to just move off that subject to another subject for just a moment, but it shows God's handiwork. And this comes from Bill Bright, the late Bill Bright, who was president of the Campus Crusade for Christ International. He had a team go into Russia to a city called Stavropol in order to distribute Bibles. They learned after they got there that in the 1930s, Stalin had ordered a purge of all Bibles and all believers from the Soviet Union. Millions of Bibles were confiscated and the Christians then sent to prison. But when they came to Stavropol, they found that they couldn't get their Bibles out of Moscow. And then somebody told them that there was a warehouse in the city that still had a lot of Bibles that Stalin had collected in the 1930s. And so they finally got up enough courage to go to the officials at the warehouse and ask if the Bibles were still there. They said yes. And then the commission asked if they could be removed and distributed again to the people of Stavropol. The answer was yes. So the next day, the commission team returned with a truck and several Russian people to help load the Bibles. One helper was a young man who was skeptical, hostile, agnostic collegian who had only come for the day's wages. As they were loading the Bibles onto the truck, one member of the team noticed that the young man had disappeared. Eventually, they found him in a corner of the warehouse weeping. He had slipped away, hoping to quietly take a Bible. What he found shook him to the core. The inside page of the Bible he picked up had the handwritten signature of his own grandmother. Out of over 1,000 Bibles,
wow.
He just happened to pick up the one that belonged to his grandmother.
Well, J.R., in the Lord, there are no coincidences.
This has got to be incredible, you know, because God can do that to a young man who is an agnostic who needs to hear from God.
Absolutely. Now, there are a lot of people on the other side who believe they're hearing from God, J.R., and I've got some news articles here. This is from Al-Bawaba, an Arab news service. Hurricane Katrina, seen by al-Qaeda leaders as the start of the United States collapse. Congratulations to the Islamic Nation, to our Sheikh Osama Abu Abdullah Osama bin Laden and Sheikh Ayman Zawahiri for the destruction of America, which is at the forefront of evil. It, that is Hurricane Katrina, is the start of its collapse. And then here is something from Al-Qaeda, and I'm quoting, Katrina, a soldier sent by God to fight on our side. The soldier Katrina joins us to fight against America. And this goes on and on. There are many, many quotes similar to this, but essentially, those on the other side, J.R., regard God as having spoken in their favor. So they're listening to God too, if you will. Perhaps a different God. But J.R., we live in a slightly different time now.
If a story could be written and come out in National Geographic's magazine 11 months before the occurrence, if a story can be written, come out in Scientific American magazine in October 2001, then this particular occurrence cannot be a coincidence. It appears to me that it has to be some kind of divine retribution. I do not agree with the Muslims, by the way.
No.
But I can tell you that in Genesis chapter 12, God says to Abraham, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And it appears that God has spoken.
J.R., we have to be delicate when we make statements like this. But sadly, our leadership now favors the two-state solution. It's favored the disengagement in Gaza, driving Jews from 67 out of their homes and so forth and so on. And we saw a refugee disengagement in Israel. We're now seeing a refugee disengagement, if you will, in New Orleans.
Yes.
And you can't help tying those together.
That's right. Could you hold up the book Eye to Eye?
Indeed, Eye to Eye, written by Bill Koenig. And by the way, Bill Koenig is a certified White House correspondent. The entire book is a documentation of this principle. And by the way, we offer this book here at Prophecy in the News.
Yes. And he says that within 24 to 48 hours after a president of the United States, he cited both Clinton and Bush over the past decade or so, that have spoken out for a Palestinian state and Israel to give up land for peace, disasters have hit America.
Absolutely.
And we have seen disaster after disaster hit America. We need to bless Israel so that we will in turn be blessed. We'll be back in just a moment. Our poor president has gone through one disaster after another: the terrorist attack, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and now this. When the tsunami came, we were royally criticized from around the world for not acting enough, quick enough or with enough to go and help the tsunami victims in the Indian Ocean. And now this. What do you think, Gary?
Well, what I think, JR, is that somebody is tapping on our window pane from on high and trying to get our attention. And I believe that as a nation we need to listen and turn to the Lord in prayer.
It's not over, folks. This may be just the beginning. The Bible tells us that one of these days there's going to be a 7-year period unlike anything history has ever seen. So trust Jesus today. He's the only way out. This is J.R. Church and Gary Sturman. Until next time, keep looking up.
Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported ministry sponsored by our many friends across America and in your area. For your gift of $10, you can receive a special edition of our current program on audio tape, or for a gift of $20, we'll send you our programs on videotape. For either order, call the 800 number on your screen right now.